Turn with me in your Bibles, please, to Joshua chapter 3. Children's Church, thank you. I never have to worry about forgetting. Somebody will remind me. The nation of Israel had a new leader, and his name was Joshua. And they were headed toward the Jordan River, about to enter the Promised Land. But before they went boldly where no Israelite had gone before, Joshua secretly sent 2 spies to cross the river and check out the area in and around Jericho. That would be their first city to attack, and with the help of God. And Joshua wanted to know the lay of the land before they went in. The spies returned a few days later with this report, Joshua chapter 2, verse 24. The Lord has given us the whole land, they said, for all the people in the land are terrified of us. What a difference this was from the report from 40 years earlier. Back then, the explorers had brought back a very negative report, that the cities were well fortified, the people were strong, and some of the people were even giants. And they convinced the other people to not obey God and to turn back. Now, 40 years later, the cities were still fortified with the latest security systems, which in those days was high, thick walls. The people were still strong. Not much had changed over the past 40 years, except for the people's trust in God and their fear of God's punishment for not doing what he told them to do. It was time for the Israelites to make their move in obedience to God, to cross the Jordan River and prepare to attack Jericho. Now, in this sermon series, we're looking at some of the struggles that we face in life. Many of the struggles we face are as difficult as trying to roll a large rock uphill. You know how difficult life struggles are. Last week, it was the struggle we all face when leadership changes. Moses at that time was 120 years old, and God was saying it was time to hand over the leadership of the nation to Joshua. We saw how God had been preparing both Joshua and the people for this transition, and Joshua had been formally installed. But then the first thing that happened as Joshua as the new leader was a weather disaster. The weather struggles that the Israelites faced was not a hurricane or a tornado, but heavy rains that came to that part of the world every year about this time, and the Jordan River overflowed its banks. That's actually a picture of the Jordan River that has overflowed its banks. Like many rivers all over the world, flood control systems had not been developed yet. Consequently, it was not unusual for many rivers to overflow their normal banks during the season of heavy rain. Now, this picture that's on the screen, the caption actually reads, 12 tourists killed and 3 still missing as this flash flood hit the Jordan River. In the first verse of Joshua 3, we find the Israelites camped near this overflowing river. God had told them to cross the river, but the weather and the flooding made it look totally impossible. There are times that we are faced with weather struggles too. For us in southern Arizona, our primary struggle with the weather is intense heat that lasts for months and months. I have friends in other places that say, well, it goes over 100 here. And I want to say, yeah, how long? 3 days? We get 5 months, sometimes 6, but oh, what a delight this fall has been. We also occasionally have haboob dust storms and microbursts with high winds that break off tree branches and sometimes flood. But over time, we've come to expect these. Now, for the Israelites, that generation have never experienced a river that they needed to cross with no bridge when the river was at flood stage. So Joshua chapter 3, we'll begin reading with verse 1. The next morning, Joshua and all the Israelites left Acacia Grove and arrived at the banks of the Jordan River, where they camped before crossing. 3 days later, the Israelite officers went through the camp, giving these instructions to the people. When you see the Levitical priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, move out from your positions and follow them. Since you've never traveled this way before, they will guide you. Stay about a half-mile behind them, keeping a clear distance between you and the ark. Make sure you don't come any closer. Then Joshua told the people, "Purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do great wonders among you." Folks, this was a great, large, huge crowd of people, hundreds of thousands of people. But when they camped, there was a God-given map for how each tribe was to position themselves, with the tabernacle in the middle. And the way they camped looked kind of like this map. It was called a camp, but we would think of it more as a huge tent city. Now, when I think of camping along a river, it's just a couple of tents pitched alongside the river. But this huge tent city was back from the river a ways and probably stretched for a couple of miles from one end to the other. Crossing a river can be dangerous. How would this huge group of people know where it was safe to cross and which areas to avoid? Joshua had told them in verses 3 and 4 that they would move out following the Ark of the Covenant, which was carried by the Levite priests. The instructions were not to rush, not to be in a hurry, but to stay well behind the Ark of the Covenant. It actually says about a half-mile behind. The symbolism of this is profound, and I love this part of the story. The symbolism was for them to acknowledge that God was leading the way. God would lead them to the best place to cross the river. I love the symbolism that even today God is leading us. Verse 6, in the morning Joshua said to the priests, "Lift up the Ark of the Covenant and lead the people across the river." And so they started out and went ahead of the people. Let me just remind you that God's plans are often much bigger and broader than we would ever imagine. If we were just reading the story about the nation crossing the Jordan River, we would not know about the deeper plans that God was working out at the same time. Verse 7, the Lord told Joshua, "Today I will begin to make you a great leader in the eyes of all the Israelites. They will know that I am with you just as I was with Moses." So in God's bigger plan, God included in affirming Joshua as the leader of the nation in the eyes of the people, just like Moses had been for the past 40 years. You know, that was an incredible gift, not only to Joshua, but also to the Israelite people. God's affirmation that you're on the right track. Here was how God intended to make this happen. Verse 8. "Give this command to the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant. When you reach the banks of the Jordan River, take a few steps into the river and stop there." Joshua told the Israelites, "Come and listen to what the Lord your God says. Today you will know that the living God is among you. He will surely drive out the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites ahead of you. Look, the Ark of the Covenant, which belongs to the Lord of the whole earth, will lead you across the Jordan River." And then verse 13, "The priests will carry the Ark of the Lord of all the earth. As soon as their feet touch the water, the flow of water will be cut off upstream, and the river will stand up like a wall." So God let them know he was going to perform a miracle. The miracle would be a great help to them. But more importantly, it was to be a sign that God was going to work with the Israelites to accomplish the mission he had given them. The mission was to drive out the pagan nations in the land who had refused to submit to God and the lifestyle he had laid out for them. The disobedience to God of these nations was resulting in the punishments of disobedience that God had told them about in Leviticus 26, which we looked at a few weeks ago. When the nations saw this miracle crossing the Jordan River, they could be confident that God would give them the promised land just like he had promised. Had anything like this ever happened before, crossing the Jordan River? Yeah, 40 years earlier when the Israelites were leaving Egypt. As they headed out of the country, God led them to be trapped between the Egyptian army who intended to recapture them and return them to their lifestyle of slavery, and trapped between them and the Red Sea. The Israelites were trapped. You'll remember how God created a dry path through the ocean for the Israelites to cross. When the Egyptian army attempted to follow them through the ocean, God closed up the path, ocean water flowed back in, and the Egyptian army drowned. Now at this point, 40 years later, only the Israelites who were between the ages of 40 and 60 might have any memory from their childhood of this incident. But those that would see the water dry up at the Jordan River would remember that this was how God had provided for them 40 years ago and how God had established Moses as their leader. Joshua 3, verse 14. So the people left their camp to cross the Jordan, and the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. It was harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched the water at the river's edge, the water above that point began backing up a great distance away at a town called Adam, which is near Zarethan. And the water below that point flowed on till the Dead Sea, until the riverbed was dry. Then all the people crossed over to the town of Jericho. Meanwhile, the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry ground in the middle of the riverbed as the people passed by. They waited until the whole nation of Israel had crossed the Jordan on dry ground. Now, you'll remember at this time of the year, the Jordan was flooding because of the heavy rains in the mountains and the area around. It's interesting that God led the people to the Jordan River at this time of year. If it had happened a few months earlier or later, it would have been a much better time because the river would have been much easier to cross. But God often does stuff like that, even with us today. His timing is very different from ours. But when God leads, he is more than able to make it happen. If they had attempted to cross the river with water in it, no matter if it was normal or at flood stage, there would have been the possibility of injuries and drownings. But with the flow of water cut off, they could simply walk across the dry riverbed, just like their parents had walked across the ocean floor of the Red Sea. So following God's timing and God's direction is always safer than what we might design on our own. There's another thing here. It says, when the water upstream stopped flowing, verse 16 says, a great distance away at the town called Adam, which is near Zarethan. Here's my question. What happened to all that water as it was stopped? The people upstream there had a terrible flood. How long did the flood last? Long enough for hundreds of thousands of people to cross downstream. Probably many, many hours that water had stopped flowing. We don't have any reports of what happened to the people of that upriver community, but later the Israelites did discover where God had placed his invisible dam on the river for the Israelites' benefit. Why had God chosen this site to stop the flow of the river? We don't know. We don't know if this was a punishment from God for their sin or if it was just nature. We also know that every flood, not every flood, is a punishment from God. Natural disasters happen both to righteous people and unrighteous people. Often we get the picture that when the Ark of the Covenant, with the priests carrying it, stepped into the water, that there was this wall of water right next to them. Not true. It says, way upstream. So picture the faith that those priests had to have. They step out into the water of this overflowing, flooding river, and it seems like nothing happens. And nothing happens. And nothing happens. And they look at Joshua and said, "So what are we doing here?" And nothing happened. And then they noticed the water level started to drop a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a lot more. And then the water stopped flowing completely. I want you to notice this was not a little path that the Israelites, all of those hundreds of thousands of people, had to cross. The whole riverbed, from there clear to the Dead Sea, was dry, no water. So those hundreds of thousands of people could just mosey on across the river, all along the way there. And after the priest had stepped out of the water on the other side, nothing seemed to happen for a while as that dam was released upstream. Pretty soon, here it came, a little trickle and then more, and then we don't know how God lifted that dam, whether it was a flash flood or a gradually increasing river, but the river went right back to flood stage. There's a section there that we have to have some faith to believe that what God tells us to do really is what we should do, even if we're not seeing anything happen right now. There was one more item on God's agenda for this miracle. All of the nations on the west side of the Jordan became afraid of Israel and their God. Look at chapter 4, verse 24. God did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Joshua chapter 5, verse 1. Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Please notice that these other nations, from the Jordan River clear to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, they were not afraid of the Israelite army because of their superior military. They were afraid because of Israel's God, who was powerful and who provided for them and fought for them. The same is true for us. It's not us that are so great, it's God. God told the prophet Zechariah in Zechariah 4, verse 6, "It's not by force nor by strength, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of heaven's armies." And Isaiah put it this way in Isaiah 26:12, "All we have accomplished is really from you." 40 years earlier, it was the Israelites who were afraid of the Amorite and Canaanite nations because of their huge size, their great strength, their fortified cities. Now, because of God's miracle over nature, the situation was reversed. It's not our strength and abilities that makes the difference. It's God, God who has power even over nature. In a recent online devotional, the famous pastor and evangelist Greg Laurie, he wrote concerning natural disasters like floods or storms. He calls them storms that he's talking about. I want to share with you the gist of that article. He says there are three kinds of storms that face people: perfecting storms, protecting storms, and correcting storms. When God allows hardships in your life to make you stronger, that's a perfecting storm. Let's use Jesus and his disciples as an example. Early in the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, Jesus led them into a perfecting storm to demonstrate to them who he was and the authority that he had. In Luke chapter 8, we read, one day Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. So they got into a boat and started out, and as they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap. You ever wonder if, when you're praying, God might be taking a nap? As they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap, but soon a fierce storm came down on the lake. The boat was filling with water, and they were in real danger. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, Master, Master, we're going to drown. When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and suddenly the storm stopped, and all was calm. And then he asked, where is your faith? Well, the disciples were terrified and amazed. Who is this man, they asked each other. When he gives a command, even in the wind and the waves obey him. The Bible describes this kind of storm in James chapter 1. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance will have a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. Can I tell you, I do not like these kinds of storms. Whoever wanted to grow and develop? I usually learn through these storms by not handling them well, and that's probably why I don't like them. This past week, I was attacked by a storm about the size of a small dust devil. Wasn't as big as a hurricane or a tornado, just a small, quick smack. And I did not respond well. But that's how most of us usually learn. I told myself that the next time I face something like this, I will, and I made a plan for how I would handle it next time. And it seems like there always is a next time. Next, there are protecting storms. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus had just fed 5,000 people with a little boy's sack lunch. All of the crowd that day had been hungry and not knowing where their next meal was going to come from. It was several hours' hike to the nearest town, and even there, they probably wouldn't be enough food at the market to feed that many people. When Jesus fed them with a little boy's sack lunch, we read that all of them ate all they wanted. What most of us don't realize when we read that is the predicament that put Jesus and his disciples in. John describes it in this way, John 6:14. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we've been expecting." When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. Now stop and think for a minute. Making Jesus king was something those disciples could really get behind. That was their goal. That's what they were expecting. And this was the ideal moment. But God had other plans for both Jesus and his disciples. So God sent them a protecting storm. Matthew tells about it in Matthew chapter 14. Immediately after this was the feeding of the 5,000, and they wanted to make him king by force. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back in the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. Can I tell you that facing a storm like that is one way to forget about your frustrations of things not turning out the way you wanted to just a little bit before? About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on water, they were terrified, and in their fear they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once and said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. You see, this storm protected Jesus' disciples from going in the wrong political direction. Many times, each of us have had something come up that changed our plans, only to discover later that the direction we were heading would have ended in a disaster. So sometimes the storms we face protect us from ourselves. And then there are correcting storms that we bring upon ourselves as we reap the consequences of our actions. Now, the Old Testament prophet Jonah was in a correcting storm, and he brought it about himself by disobeying the Lord. Jonah was on a ship headed in the wrong direction, and God sent a powerful storm, and it looked like the ship would sink. Jonah told the ship's crew that he was the cause of the storm and that they should throw him overboard. The Bible actually describes the crew's response. In Jonah chapter 1, then they, the crew, cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. "O Lord," they pleaded, "don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. O Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons." Then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. Good idea. Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. That storm was sent to correct Jonah. Now, not all storms are punishments from God, but some are, and this was one, and it was meant to correct Jonah and put him in a different direction. Storms are going to come into all of our lives as Christians, and they come in the many forms, some in the forms of just plain old problems and struggles. Some are medical issues, some are marital problems, some are legal issues, and some various other kinds of things. We should expect storms because they will come. For the Israelites at this point, their storm was heavy rain upstream from the place they were supposed to cross the Jordan River, and the river was flooding over its banks. And God stopped the flow of water upstream so his people could cross on dry land. But in the process, God accomplished so much more than just getting people across the flooded river. He let them know that he would go before them and would help them accomplish the mission that he had sent them on. He solidified Joshua as their leader. He struck fear into the hearts of all the surrounding nations, and he blessed this generation of Israelites for doing what he had asked them to do. Folks, God is usually at work doing so much more than we could ever see or imagine. Maybe you're in a storm right now. I don't know what kind of storm it's in. It may be a perfecting storm or a protecting storm or a correcting storm. But here's the good news about storms. Storms have a beginning, a middle, and the end. Maybe your storm has been raging for a while, but you might be near the end of it. So don't give up and don't lose hope. We're going to sing about one of those storms. Musicians are coming. And it talks about us not being afraid, even though, and it gives several different kinds of things that God's people have faced.
Confidence because I've seen the faithfulness of God, the still inside the storm, the promise of the shore. I trust the power of your word, enough to seek your kingdom first, beyond the barren place, beyond the ocean waves. When I walk through the waters, I won't be overcome. When I go through the rivers, I will not be drowned. My God will make a way, so I am not afraid. You keep the promises you made. There isn't one that is delayed, so I will not lose heart. Here I will lift my arms and start to sing into the night. My praise will cause the sun to rise, declare the battle won, declare that it is done. When I walk through the waters, I won't be overcome. When I go through the rivers, I will not be drowned. My God will make a way, so I am not afraid. When I am in the fire, I will not feel the flame. I'll stand before the giant, declaring victory. My God will make a way, so I am not afraid. Before me, behind me, always beside me. No shadow, no valley, where you
Isn't God good? We will face storms, but He'll see us through them. A little different benediction today. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen. You are dismissed. Thank you.